Hello everyone. Now we're going to move on to Egypt. It's our next in our chronological look at major Neolithic River Valley civilizations. And, while you may just remember that via memorization, I want you to push for other ways to make your life a little bit easier in this course. Again, if you spend some time thinking about geography on the basic locations of places, you can use some common sense to figure out the diffusion of events, of technologies, of cultures, and the like, right? So we know that our first major civilizations pop up in Mesopotamia. So it makes sense that the nearest river valley that is fertile, right, that can help support a large population and surplus and the like, that the one that is nearest to Mesopotamia will be the next to have a major civilization, right? So let's use our logic, let's use our common sense and not just try to memorize everything, right? So here we have Egypt, and due to its proximity to all these other areas, they're going to be in constant contact with Mesopotamians, with Mediterranean groups like the Phoenicians, as well as other Nubian groups. So they're not isolated, they're trading a lot, they're going to be very prosperous because of that. And yet, we'll see they're slightly more peaceful than the Mesopotamians, again, due to geographic regions, right? So, major settlements and civilizations in Egypt will arise around 3200 BCE, so slightly delayed as compared to the Mesopotamians. And from 3200 BCE through about 3000 BCE, we have a semi-decentralized Egypt. We have a kingdom in Lower Egypt, a kingdom in Upper Egypt, and some other smaller kingdoms that are at least attempting to function autonomously along the Nile River, right? And of course, if we just take a little bit more time to analyze the geography of Egypt, it'll make a lot of sense why Egypt develops politically as it does. Thinking back to your studies of Egypt in elementary school and junior high, you should remember that the Nile River is really unique in that it has a pattern, right? It floods regularly. So once the people settling along the Nile begin to be able to track those flooding patterns, they can plan their agriculture accordingly and not deal with major devastation of flooding, right? Instead, they're just reaping, the serious benefits of this very fertile river valley. And eventually, we see major agricultural societies go up and down the Nile River. So even before we see the rise of seriously famous pharaohs and all the greatness of Egypt, right, there is evidence of some basic farming and large settlements of people. But starting around 3000 BCE, we see Egypt depart from what's going on in Mesopotamia. And instead of being all these competitive city-states and all of these empires sweeping in and displacing each other, we see a centralized Egypt, starting with King Menes, seen here around 3000 BCE. And as I said before, this has to do with geography, right? So we have one river that we can centralize around. And the other nature of the Nile, which is that it flows north into the Mediterranean, and yet there's a wind that travels south, means that we can use the Nile as a highway to further connect us north and south. The other thing that allows for the centralization of Egypt is the fact that we have some other natural boundaries that make it a little bit more difficult for other groups to sweep in and topple the government of Egypt. So they just endure longer periods of peace, right? We have deserts over here, and also not big populations over to the west, so there's less of a threat of invasion from the west. Also, the Sinai Peninsula over here is yet another kind of barrier. It's slightly mountainous, and there's lots of desert. So we just have fewer groups that are willing to traverse that to fight the Egyptians. Instead, it's more profitable for all these other groups, whether it's the Phoenicians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, to trade with the Phoenicians. So we have longer periods of peace and prosperity, and this will give the Egyptian civilization more of a optimistic feel. We see more general equality amongst the people, still stratification of classes and the like, but we just see, just a lot more happiness. We can especially see that in the religion. The pharaohs, who are the centralized authority of Egypt, will use religion to legitimize their rule. As you should remember from your studies when you were young, the pharaohs go a step further from the Mesopotamian kings who claim descent from the gods or blessings from the gods, but they go so far as to claim that they are living gods, right? So you're not going to question a living God. And this is helped by the fact that Egypt is pretty successful, right? The Nile River and its regularity produces food surplus. We see fewer famines in Egypt than we do in Mesopotamia. We see less war because of the geographic protection in Egypt than we do in Mesopotamia. So people are buying into this concept of these living gods because things are working out. There's peace, there's prosperity, there's all this good stuff. And so the pharaohs further consolidate their centralized rule. So here, of course, we see the famous busts, of King Tut and statues in the Valley of the Kings, all the elaborate funeral processes, and the concept that, our pharaohs go on to live in the next life. In fact, they looked at this world as kind of a necessary evil, that the next life is far better. So there's great hope in, what's to come after you die versus Mesopotamia, where it's like, oh, you die and that's it. So the optimism of Egypt versus the pessimism of Mesopotamia. And so here we have the geography directly leading to this type of political structure, right? So pharaohs, everything falls under their authority. And we do have an example of a female pharaoh. There's questions if there were even more throughout history, but our main example of a female pharaoh is seen here, known as Pharaoh or Queen Hatshepsut. I'm not so good at Egyptian pronunciation, so excuse me, but here we see her, and you can visit this statue at the Met in New York City. So here she's female. You can tell a little phenotypically that she has a kind of softer face, other anatomical features indicating her femininity, but still shown as very strong. She led over a very prosperous time period, built a lot of, great structures, not the pyramids or anything like that, but was believed to have been a pretty strong leader. However, I want to take a second, right, and give you this warning, right? Beware the history of exceptionality. As we study all different forms of history this year, but especially as we study gender history, okay? Gender history is so much more than the first woman to do this or the only woman to do whatever, right? All history is more than the one random person who did it or a succession of kings and generals or whatever, right? Well, if we really want to understand a political history, an economic history, a gender history, a social history, right? We need to look to other things, right? To understand true people's history, don't just look at politics. Don't just look at a succession of leaders, right? To truly understand, in this case, gender history, look to daily life. What are people doing every day? That adds up to so much more history than one random woman, right? Look to economics, right? How are they, allowing their society to prosper? Look to their religion, because religion is always a window into the values of a society. So if we're trying to understand gender a little bit better within Egyptian society, we can look at a lot of art. In this case, if we look at some tomb art, here we see a couple showing true affection, and this is rampant in Egyptian art, to show love between couples. When we compare that to Mesopotamia and we see how terribly women are treated, we can see that Egypt, in this case, is very special, right? That women were shown this type of affection, and legally, right? Women had many of the same rights as men. It wasn't pure equality. I'm not going to say that. There's definitely a patriarchy here, but compared to these other societies, they had the ability to have money, to initiate divorce, to be protected in a lot of ways, and are obviously respected. Again, here we see in more tomb art women being shown as purveyors of culture, playing music. Here they're shown as the role of mothers within a court, and here they're shown together, right? This kind of feminine community, and obviously, as we see them, with their children, they're shown respectfully. So they are valued for their role as a mother. Also in Egypt, and again, I want to point this out as a commonality in many societies, women here are shown doing one of the most important economic activities women do throughout the world, which is weaving, right? Textiles. Very important to almost every society, and women are usually at the center of that. So here we have all these Egyptian women weaving cotton, and Egyptian cotton is one of the biggest exports from Egypt for all of history. Still today, Egyptian cotton is considered a great luxury, right? So here are the bigger ways that women are participating in Egyptian life. Our female pharaohs are very important. I don't want to overlook them, right? But that's not the only thing I want you to discuss if I ever ask you about women in society, right? Let's think to the bigger issues of economics, daily life, religion, all that type of stuff. As I said, religion is a good way to understand gender as well. If you look at a society, and women play a kind of great role in the belief system of that place, that gives you kind of an indication of how much or how little that society values their women. In the case of Egypt, we have a huge pantheon of gods, most of whom are men, right? But we do have some significant female goddesses. And one thing that's interesting about Egypt is that at some point, this pantheon builds and builds and builds, and it's almost kind of overwhelming. People can't possibly acknowledge each of the gods enough. And so what we see is the rise of cults. So instead of worshiping all the gods, people would focus on one of those gods. Doesn't mean you deny the other gods, it's just you have a favored god. And one of the most important cults that arises is the cult of Isis, who is kind of the goddess of life, fertility and all these other things. And so the fact that her cult is one of the largest and also one that pops up all over the place. Cults of Isis are shown in Nubia, which we'll discuss in a second. Later on, the Romans kind of pick up this cult of Isis again, which is seen as a very powerful force. And so, again, another window into how women are more respected in Egypt than in a lot of other places. Not directly related to women per se, but another interesting intersection of religion and gender is the story of Akhenaten. So Pharaoh Akhenaten is interesting in that he is our one pharaoh in ancient Egypt who tries to depart from the tradition of polytheism by attempting to change the religion to a monotheistic religion that only worships the sun god Ra, which is seen here in this stela, this relief. This is the Pharaoh Akhenaten shown in Sphinx forms, worshiping the sun. This was a failed religious experiment in ancient Egypt. Many people believe he did this, out of true faith. Some scholars believe he was doing this to really make a name for himself, right, to control the culture and thus really control Egypt. I don't know the answer, but one thing that fascinates me about Akhenaten is how he looked, and there are many questions surrounding this, but here is Akhenaten, the pharaoh who is worshiping Ra right there, the sun. Behind him is Nefertiti, his queen, and then his children. But if you look at the body shape of Akhenaten, and if you were to kind of Google search more images of the stela of Akhenaten, he's seen with a very feminine body. In fact, some of his busts, when they go down and show some of his body, he's seen to have breasts. Here he has kind of very, curvy lower body, which is usually reserved for, the feminine build. So there's, a great question. Was Akhenaten possibly transgendered? Did he try to show himself as gender fluid, right? Kind of going back and forth between male and female to kind of transcend gender markers to be some all-powerful being? Was he possibly intersex? I don't know. But it's very interesting to see this in the ancient world. If we continue to look at the politics and society of Egypt, we can see that just like in Mesopotamia, we have a social hierarchy, right, with Pharaoh at the top, and similar to Mesopotamia, the priests are in the second tier, and probably had even more of a role since, religion and politics were so intertwined in Egypt. Underneath were the scribes and the craftspeople, and then underneath is a huge laboring class. Now, one thing the scholarship is showing is that the slave class was probably smaller than we think in Egypt. Usually we think of gigantic slave populations that helped to build all the fantastic structures of Egypt. But there was probably just a gigantic laboring class that just wasn't paid very much, is what scholarship is showing. Now, when we think about that structure of society, it makes sense then that the technology of production, by this I mean the technology that is innovated to make work easier for the laborers, that type of technology was not as advanced as it was in Mesopotamia, right? This makes sense because the larger peasant laboring class or larger slave class a society has, they care about those people, right? If you have a huge slave class, what do you care if all these slaves die in the process of making some temple? If you have a huge laboring class who aren't slaves, who are free, but we've convinced those people that all the work they're doing is for the living God, the Pharaoh, then they're not going to rebel that work is so hard. But when we have a society that is in competition with others, so you want rapid fire advancement, or we need to pay those workers, we want to make technology that leads to efficiency, right? So large slave class or large labor class societies usually have less advanced technologies for production. Doesn't mean they don't have anything. Here we see a man using what's called a shaduf in order to irrigate their crops. We can see some very basic tools being used for farming purposes. But more than likely, the images of production or large-scale projects in Egypt look more like this, just lots of people doing a ton of manual labor. And so in order to build the gigantic pyramids, it's not so important that we have great tools. It's important that we have a lot of people. Another type of technology or innovation that we know about as connected to Egypt are, of course, the hieroglyphs, which were used to tell the stories of the pharaohs and of the religion. Also, later when papyrus, a very thick paper technology is made, we'll tell other stories or also use it to record other innovations in economic transactions and the like. But of course we know anytime we have glyph type writing or character-based writing, it's going to be a more elite form of writing. It's hard to memorize all of these types of glyphs. So the number of people who can write in Egyptian society is minuscule, teeny, teeny, tiny, right? The one technology that is absolutely amazing in Egypt as compared to like Mesopotamia is medicine. When we find these papyri that outline the medical techniques of Egypt, we find that they could do, or at least would attempt to do, brain surgeries, that they could extract cataracts from the eye, which if you think about when this is happening and getting anywhere near a human eye successfully, like it's totally amazing. They successfully used herbs to heal many different types of diseases. They understood how to prevent pregnancy, to keep population down so that everybody could be healthy. I mean, truly amazing stuff. And the reason they were so good at this is because the way they experimented with the human body, because of their very elaborate mummification system. Right, the belief that we should preserve the nobility's bodies so they could enter into the next life so amazingly, shown in this illustration here, means that they weren't afraid to open the human body. So as they opened it for purposes of mummification, they were doing dissection. They understood where their liver was, where the heart was. They understood the kidneys, all the different organs. And so via this process, they were studying the body and how to then treat it as well and applying that to daily life, right? So a really impressive technological improvement by the Egyptians. Egypt begins to push south into the Nubian kingdoms in an imperial era. So I do want to briefly discuss their interactions with Nubia. They specifically take over a growing kingdom named Kush in what's called Upper Egypt, down here. Ethnically, I do want to say these are different groups. We would consider the Egyptians similar to our Arab ethnic groups today. The Kush were Bantu-based people, as we discussed the Bantu migrations. That's what would have populated this area. So as they pushed further south, they were doing so to get resources and also to get more laborers in the forms of slaves to do all the fantastic architectural feats that we know comes from Egypt. And I think that this is one of the most interesting artifacts to come out of this interaction. I actually saw this at the King Tut exhibit that was going around the country a few years ago. And what this is a staff that the pharaoh would have held. And at the top of the staff was a Nubian slave, right? His back kind of bent and groundbreaking, possibly, showing this moment of the history between Kush and Egypt, and when Egypt fully dominated Kush. So here we have, very early in the history, one group fully taking over another. Over time, things begin to somewhat equalize. Egypt is usually much stronger than Kush, and so they will from time to time invade. But there are moments when there is some relative peace, and it's a bit of a symbiotic relationship. Here's an image found in an Egyptian tomb of an envoy from Kush, politicians and merchants going to pay tribute to the pharaoh because we can get these great foodstuffs and other resources from Egypt. Egypt, in return, is getting a lot of ivory and also iron metallurgy. The Kush were extremely good at iron metallurgy, so they're getting those types of goods from the Nubians, and so sometimes it'd be a fairly peaceful relationship. At certain points, around the year 700 BCE, the pharaohs were not very strong in Egypt, and they're weak enough that the Nubian king was able to amass an army and actually take over Egypt. So we have a stretch of about 100 years in which Egypt was actually ruled by the Nubian pharaohs. These are known as the Black Pharaohs, as National Geographic did a great article on a couple years ago. And so, we have kind of this back and forth relationship between the two, although for the majority of time, it's Egypt dominating Kush. And with that, it's time to begin to internalize one of the key mantras of our course. Acculturation is active selection, not passive reception. By this, I mean that whenever we have an interaction, like the Egypt-Kush interaction, in which one group dominates another, the assumption is that that stronger group is going to be able to successfully push its beliefs and its practices on that weaker group, and that weaker group will just accept it because they are weak. That might work in the short term, but if we look at the long-term history of a subjected group, and we look at the things that they took from that stronger group, a group will only keep something that works for them. They will keep what works, they will twist it in a way, right, that reflects their own belief systems or their histories. But something will only stay long-term if it is useful. In the case of the Egyptian, Kush interactions, Kush does use a lot of what Egypt did. What worked for the Kush that they kept, but of course put their own spin on, were concepts of divine right and many of their religious practices. We see the rise, of pharaohs, right? Their political organization was just like Egypt's, with pharaohs who ruled via divine right. Also, they used a lot of the gods of the Egyptians. They found some truth within that. It rang useful for their society, and so they continued to use that. So we see, Isis and Ra and all those other gods show up in the Kush pantheon alongside of the original gods that they had worshipped. This is an image of a Nubian king, and a lot of it was destroyed, but these are the wings of Isis as she's protecting him. So they kept that. And here we have, pharaohs standing kind of very strong with some Nubian features. Although sometimes here they would kneel to show a little bit of kind of humility, right, which is one of the values that persists in some Nubian art. They also built pyramids, right? They entombed their kings very similarly to the Egyptians did. So this worked for them. They liked this, so they kept it. Things that didn't work, for example, were hieroglyphs. For a short period of time, you see Egyptian hieroglyphs used by the Nubians, but they're abandoned pretty quickly because they're difficult. It didn't work. It's a slightly more equal society, the Nubian kingdoms, and so we need more people to be writing. And so instead, they adopted an alphabet, Meroitic alphabet, which is the script is seen here, because it is easier, or it was more fluid. It's also possible that they adopted this because of a lot of contact with Mediterranean groups, as Phoenician and other Mediterranean sailors went down the Nile to get ironwork and ivory from the Kush and Nubian peoples, and so they adopted that type of alphabet, having that interaction with them. This is an example of a more Mediterranean type architecture found in and around Nubia, right, showing that type of interaction that they were having. So keep that in mind. Acculturation is active selection, not passive reception. People take what they want and make it theirs. All right, so here we will stop our discussion of Egypt, and next we will kind of move out concentrically and hit upon India.